Good afternoon, all of you. Thank you for coming for this fourth workshop that we have about Heureka. And today we will be talking, well, as you know, about the narrative, the components of a grant proposal. So before we start, maybe if you can just introduce yourself, who you are, and which department.
I'm Catherine Richardson, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Global Studies.
I am Francesca Favara, and I'm assistant professor in the Department of Aviation and Technology.
Cara Maffini, assistant professor, counselor education.
Emily Slesser, child and adolescent development. Arun Jensen, assistant professor from Kinesiology Department. Sorry, I'm
This is Larry Rhetorical from the Biomedical Engineering Department.
Alessandro Belfiore, assistant professor in biomedical engineering as well.
Farshid Marbuti, assistant professor of general engineering.
David Anastasiou, assistant professor from computer engineering.
Len Wesley, associate professor, computer science.
You can go there.
Oh, I'm temporary RTVF teaching film and TV production.
Okay. At the back.
Chao Li, assistant professor from journalism and mass communications.
I'm Neil Switz. I'm an assistant professor of physics and astronomy.
Hi, I'm Yen Zhang. I'm from mathematics.
Yeah, I'm Matthew Johnson, and also from mathematics, assistant professor.
And we just had Yen who entered. You can just introduce yourself and where you are from.
Sure. Hi, I'm Yan Tran, and I'm from the library.
Okay, thank you. So before we start, we will just introduce everybody who will be available today to talk about this topic, but at the same time, I just want to remind you, as most of you are aware of that, this is a collaborated effort from different units on campus, from the Research Foundation, the Tower Foundation, the Office of Research, and the library, because if you remember in one of our last topics, we had a representative of the library who talked about some resources available there. So first, I will ask my colleagues to present themselves to you.
I'm Michelle Vaccaro. I'm the Senior Sponsored Programs Manager at the Research Foundation.
I'm Paul McNamara. I work at Corporate Foundation Relations at University Advancement. We do the fundraising for campus, and this is my colleague Michelle Smith, also Corporate Foundation Relations.
Yes.
Okay. And
I'm Brenda Swan. I am Senior Manager Information Services, Office of Sponsored Programs, Research Foundation.
And I'm Gilles Muller, the Associate Dean of Research from the Office of Research. So thank you for being here today, and let's start right away. So first, what will we be doing today? So we will talk about the different elements that we need to consider when you want to write your narrative of a grant proposal, because as you know, it's very important. This is where you will disclose what you want to do to a potential funder, and you really want to sell your idea to make sure that they will support you. So as we mentioned earlier, here we have most of the people who can help you. The only person who is missing is Michelle. But if needed, we can provide this information and add it on the slide.
How many of you have done a grant in here? Yeah, so they're more or less the same, whether it's internal or external, whether it's public or private. The difference is there is all the stuff that goes around it. But in general, this is the grant life cycle. So you start with your idea. I have an idea, I want to do something, I need money for it. You identify potential funders, and in your case, there's three main sources of funding. There's corporations, foundations, and there's public money. And public money can be divided into federal grants, state grants, county grants, city grants. But the big money is obviously in federal grants. There's 26 granting agencies in the United States. Michelle's going to talk more about that. And then you develop and submitting your proposal. And this is what we're doing today. It's how to develop your idea and convert it into a narrative proposal. The other part of this proposal is also a budget. So we did a separate workshop on budgeting. If you did not hear that, you can get a recording of it, right? And is the recording on your site?
So as soon as it's ready, we will email it to everybody.
Yeah. Okay, so there's so a proposal is really two things. It's a narrative and a budget. plus all the stuff that goes with it, but those are the essential things. You get your award. Sometimes you negotiate it, meaning that, let's say you apply for $300,000 and they're going to give you $250 or $200, whatever it is, some reduction. So you need to give them a budget revision plus a reduction in the scope. It is very important that if and when you get a grant, I should say when you get a grant, if you're ever asked to reduce the amount, always reduce the scope. A lot of times people will put the same scope forward with less money. That just means there's a higher burden on you to do more work, really is what it is. And I see it more and more. I work in the private world. I used to work at the Research Foundation, so I did federal grants for 5 years. Do you guys do many budget reductions?
Not as much as we used to.
I'm seeing more and more of them in the private foundation world, and we can talk about that. So that's what we mean by negotiation.
Is it typical that they allow you to reduce scope, or is it
that they require you to reduce the scope, not allow.
So if they tell you they're coming in at 80% of your request, then you're not at risk of being like, okay, well the scope goes down, and they're like, oh no, we're not going to fund that.
Not at all. You have to. I mean, that's my main point, and I always tell faculty that reduce the scope of the work, because they get what they're paying for, right? Because unless you want to do it, I mean, unless you say, you know what, I can only do it. And there's certain projects where you have to. There's a minimum threshold, right? I need to do this amount of work in order to achieve this project. If that's the case, that's when you go into negotiations.
So that in general, if you are like, okay, the scope has to reduce, people like, we've already decided to give you money, we are giving you money, and the question is just come to an agreement on the scope.
Right.
They're not going to be like, oh no, now we're taking it back.
No, once they like your idea, once they agree to fund it, they're going to fund it. I mean, I've seen, well, I can give you lots of examples, but there's more in the philanthropic world. This is really with foundations, because just to be clear, if you're not familiar, there's chairs up here too if you want to come up here. Be easier for you. And when we talk about philanthropy, so for those of you that don't know, philanthropy is mainly 3 sources of funding: individuals, corporations, foundations. Michelle and I do foundations. We do a few corporations. There's 2 other people in our office who do corporations, and then individuals. And in the philanthropic world in the United States, 80% of philanthropy is individuals. So there's a section I'm going to talk about in here where it's how to frame your work if you're going to end up going after individual donations. Each of you has a development officer in our office who works with the dean just on individual donations. But if you think that if somebody approaches you or you hear about somebody who might be interested in funding your work, we can talk about that too. Contact one of us and we'll put you in touch with those people. So then the award's set up. That means from here, once you get it, what Michelle and I and this Michelle do is called pre-award. I do a little bit more post-award. Post-award is once you get the grant, but then Michelle would turn you over to a post-award analyst, and they help you spend your money. They help you hire. They help you do travel expenditures. They help you do your cost requisitions, and then submit the reports. And then managing your project, obviously, goes hand in hand with, and then closing it out. And that's the grant life cycle. Okay, any questions on that? All right. Elements of a proposal should cover the problem or the issue, why it matters, what will be done, how it will be implemented, methodology, assessment, metrics, and impact. So when I said that each proposal, regardless of the source of the funds, is more or less the same. Say you meet an individual, I'm going to give you both extremes. And you say, I have this project going on, it's going to be $5,000 for 3 months. They're like, great, send me something. What they mean by send me something is send me 1 page. You more or less have to cover these elements. When you apply for oftentimes federal grants and even private grants, you'll be required to submit a letter of intent or a letter of inquiry. It's because federal agencies, as I said, there's 26 of them, but they get tens of thousands. NIH alone gets upwards of 80,000 proposals a year. So they want to vet more or less who's going to apply. Same with private foundations. They'll have you do a 1-page summary that basically touches on each one of these points. Maybe it's 50 to 100 characters each. They just want to get a snapshot. Because even though, especially in the private foundation world, They'll put the parameters up there, they'll talk about their mission, everybody applies. And so they will send you a very polite email back saying, no, this does not fall into our category, or yes, please submit a full proposal. There's other agencies, other foundations where it's a little bit more formal, it's a little bit more, this might be 2 or 3 pages. I have one now to the Hewlett Foundation for $500,000 for cybersecurity. It was about 3 pages. They didn't really give us a format, but I know the format, so I had the faculty write it out in this format. Now, if they like it again, they're going to contact us again, and we're going to submit probably a 15-page proposal. So we're not going to talk about letter of intent in here today. We did on the previous grant. I can talk a little bit about it, but more or less in 1 to 2 pages, this would be like a paragraph each. Imagine, right? What is the need? What's the problem you're addressing in your particular area? Why does it matter? What are you going to do? Which is the scope of work. We plan to do, an assessment within this particular population over this period of time in hopes of achieving this particular goal. How will it be implemented? Which is the methodology. About 12 years ago, there was a faculty, an associate dean in the College of Engineering, who, at one point, when he became the associate dean, he wanted to figure out why we were getting turned down so often. So we took about 5 years of data he had a graduate student do this, and we went through all the comments from the reviewers from National Science Foundation, predominantly because that was engineering. And well, I've seen this anecdotally in lots of different areas, but it was true here as well. This is the weakest part of most proposals, which is the methodology. How are you going to execute your particular scope of work? So we can talk about methodology in general, but they'll agree with with the need and what it is you're going to do, but how you're going to go about doing it needs to be very, very specific. Now, if you can't be specific here, it's going to be really hard to come up with metrics, because how are they going to know that you move the needle? How are you going to know what you mean by measuring success?
So some of the feedback I've had as well from in that respect has been along the lines of SJSU is not a primary research institution. You're not a PhD granting institution. So how are you going to implement this is not just an issue of your methodology per se, of how you're going to, the methods you're going to apply to solve the problem, the algorithms you're going to come up to fix, to come up with a solution to the problem you're proposing, but the, having the resources with regards to the students to work on the problems, with regards to the hardware, for example, we don't necessarily have the same compute resources that tier 1 research institutions have. So how have you seen some of the successful applications address those issues? So that they sort of mitigate that type of instinctual response from the reviewers?
That's an extremely good question. So the short answer is it's hard to do that. It's hard to do that because we're a state university. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the master plan in California, it was devised in the 1960s. There were, at the time, 12 colleges, I think, or 12 universities that were teaching universities, and the other 9, which are the UCs, which are research institutes. So there is I would call it a myth, that the CSUs don't do research. We do $45 to $50 million a year, right? A couple years ago, we got a $71 million grant from NASA, where we just submitted a $93 million grant, right, to NASA for the same project, et cetera. But it's hard to convince the powers that be, and this is mostly East Coast, because they're up against R1 institutions. So to answer your question, how do you do that? Oftentimes, when I'm going to come to a section where we talk about why here, why now, why you, why San Jose State. That's where you really want to do it. You want to talk about the momentum of research that this institution has. You want to talk about the regional hook, right? So I'm going to do, for our film friend, I'm going to talk a couple of different metaphors that you can use for approaching a narrative, but one of them is through the mindset of how you would approach a film script, actually. And so there's a concept in there which is the hook, which is, you know, why should I fund you? What's the hook? Why you? Why is this unique? So it's a longer conversation, but regional input is one thing. Nobody else is doing it. You have to talk about why you're uniquely qualified. It is a challenge, though, around what they mean by that when they give you that feedback is that we don't have as much institutional infrastructure to provide resources as an R1 or UC. That means lab space, that means a given TA, that means additional assign time, right? So here, mostly what you're asking for when you buy this, when you submit your proposal with your cost budget is you're buying your time. With R1s, you're buying your time and they're giving you time. They reward you, right? So that's what they mean by that. So it's hard for us to kind of mitigate that wholly, but I don't know, those other reasons, maybe you have some additional advice on what that, how to address that. It's a salient issue. Hold on.
So just to add on what Paul said, in a way, always when you look at what you want to do, the scope of work, make sure it's something that we can do here. So you have to demonstrate what are the resources, and if you are not sure, and that's why it's also important, as we mentioned it several times, you start early on to work on your project, and this is where you can talk to the different people. By different people, it could be the two foundations, the Office of Research, in your college, your Associate Dean for Research if you have one, or you can come to us in the Office of Research and we can see how we can help you to address those questions. Because it's true that, in fact, it depends how you will write it in your proposal. So that's very important. And sure, what you don't want to do is to promise, oh, I will do X things, but we know that we cannot do it. This is where you risk to be in this situation. The other point I would suggest is that Paul mentioned the regional impact. Sometimes there are things that you cannot do here. Maybe you can do a collaboration with someone who is at a university next to us, and that's another way also, and that's the reason why sometimes you want to consider collaborators working with you. They may bring some expertise that you may not have, and this would be also a way to address it. So that's what yeah.
I just continue with your question. Actually, so now this is my first year, so I haven't applied it better. But I got a good advice from my mentor, my PhD mentor. Since I'm not in a research one school, but he is, right?
Right.
And then what he suggested me to do is, before aiming for maybe an NIH R1 immediately, don't do that, because they're not gonna fund you because your institution is not R1, and also you have not shown that you're capable. So what he wanted me to do first is look for a smaller grant in an NIH, more like R21 or R15, which targeted for us, for the not the research one school, and then you gain that in the repetition that you are capable, you have that productivity, and then they will fund you. So maybe, I don't know if it's related to that, but it could be.
Yeah, it's true. And another one, for instance, for NIH that you can consider, if you are in the within the biomedical umbrella, there is the NIH SCORE program, which is a good one. And often we have a lot of faculty from chemistry and biology recently who got it, the SC3. That's a good one to start. It's in fact reserved to institutions like us who have URM students who qualify for a URM. So that's a good one. And if you need more information, I can provide you the information. But I know that, for instance, Michel, for instance, this is something that at the Research Foundation they can provide you. For NSF, there is also one that you can consider. It's the RUI. And it's also a good one to start because it's not, you do not compete with R01 university. It's reserved to universities like us. So it's RUI.
What does it stand for?
It's research at undergrad institution, something like that.
NIH is R15.
NIH,
So you said R15, but you said something else.
the SCORE program.
Yeah, what's that?
So this is for the minority institutions. I can provide you the information if you want.
What's the acronym?
SCORE, S-C-O-R-E.
Sometimes they're known as SC3.
Yeah, the main one that we have on campus is the SC3. In fact, they have three types, the SC1, SC2, and SC3. But if you want, we can talk about that more. I can provide some information. But that's a good one too, if you are within NIH, what they fund, because you do not compete with everybody. And when you are at the beginning, they also consider that you are a new investigator. So that's something. And usually the proposal, it's a 6-page narrative proposal, which means that it's only 6 pages, but you have to put everything in 6 pages instead of 50.
What does the RUI stand for?
RUI, it's a research undergrad institution, research at undergrad institutions.
Okay, and it's under NSF?
Yeah, NSF, yes. So those are the ones I would say that it's better that you start at the beginning if you can do that. And then if you want, you can go to the R01 type of grants. Because in fact, you will have preliminary data. And for preliminary data, often what you can do is to use the internal grant opportunities that you have from your college, the infusion funds, or from the university central funds. So those are good ways to start. And then you can apply to the NIH SCORE program, the RUI at NSF, etc. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, as I understand it, San Jose State, even despite our teaching load, apparently we're in the top 200 universities in the United States when it comes to research. So even though we're hemmed in between Stanford and Berkeley, I don't think that we should undersell ourselves.
No, you shouldn't. As I said earlier, to answer the question, you really need to demonstrate that the scope of work you want to do, you can do it. And you are the one who can demonstrate that by providing all the information and showing to the funder, yes, I can do it because I have all of those resources, what I need.
Is through partnerships. So if you know, let's say somebody you went to graduate school with, or a former mentor of yours, or another university where you can partner with them, and I do a lot of those right now actually, in private grants. And so you're basically using the equity of the larger university or somebody who has more experience. That's one thing. The other thing too is if you've already done work in this area, if you've already demonstrated some outcomes and some evidence-based research around this particular area, that mitigates the risk, especially if somebody else has already invested in your work initially, or work that you're affiliated with through, let's say, another principal investigator at another university, whether that was your mentor or another colleague or whatever. So there's a foundation that I apply to every couple of years. It's a big scientific foundation, and they always ask the question, has this been funded previously from National Science Foundation or a federal agency? And what they're looking for is some sort of sanction, that this has been received or invested in, or there's the merit, it rose to the merit of federal funding. So there's lots of different ways to come at that answer.
And in fact, this is the follow-up that what you are talking.
Right. So these are the qualities, I guess you could say, in terms of characteristics of a proposal. Clarity is number one. Responsiveness, language, is it a good fit? This is especially true of private foundations. As I said before, the reason they ask for that letter of intent is because they want to make sure that it fits within the mission. Now, the rhetorical way that you're going to approach a private entity versus a federal entity is going to be somewhat different. It's going to be more familiar. It's going to be more personal. You're going to tell more of a human story, if you will. I taught writing for a long time, and when I look at proposals, and I did this in writing, with a grant proposal, you want the right balance between logic and emotion, right? You want data and research. If it's all logic, if it's all data, it's stale, it's stilted, right? It's cold, right? If it's all story and narrative and emotion, it's too warm and fuzzy. It's too overwhelming. It's desperate. Oftentimes it can, you know what I mean? It can come across as being, too familial without enough substantiation or evidence. So it's usually a 70-30 or an 80-20 balance of reason, mostly because if you're going to apply for federal grants and the other ones. So that really comes into the whole notion of fit. Rigor and quality, again, all of these, if you look at these qualities right here, whatever you submit, you want to make sure that it is of the highest quality, meaning there are no spelling errors. I cannot tell you how many grants I got back when I was at the Research Foundation, because with federal grants, you usually get anywhere between 3 and 5 reviews. They have to give you the reviews from the program officers, because it's public money. They're accountable for it, which is really good. So if you apply for a grant, I always say this, even when I was there doing these workshops, the chance of you getting a federal grant is usually around 10%. It jumps to 60% upon a resubmittal. Why? Because you can then take the reviews, address the reviews, and then resubmit. That's true with National Science Foundation. I don't know if it's still that percentage, but you want to make sure that there are no mistakes. So what I started to say was that I used to get reviews, and it would say, please consider using spell check before submitting this next time, right? So, or tense agreements. So, you're all really, really good at what you do. You may not be a stellar writer in terms of this, and even if you're a really good writer, and all of you are probably really good writers because you have to grade papers from your students, this is still highly rhetorical, right? It may not be your area. I'm a professional writer. Anything I write that's going to be substantial, that I'm going to publish, that's going to go to the president, I give it to 2 or 3 people to read, because you're too close to it yourself. And so I always tell people when they write something, give it to somebody who knows your field. Give it to somebody who might be in your field but might not know your work. Give it to a third person who doesn't know anything about your field. And does it read? Can they basically understand what it is that you want to do? That might change a little bit if it's highly complicated, if it's highly computational, if the vernacular is within a particular area, then just stick to the area that you know, but give it to other people to see if it really works that way. But in general, you want to make sure that you go through it for these things. Next slide.
So the next slide, this is where we will start talking about the different strategies and to go into a few aspects that we need to consider. And the first one is, Paul, about your document.
Okay, so writing with clarity and power. Did everyone get a copy of this document that I handed out? Does anyone not have it? I just want to go through this. This is a little something that I put together that are just sort of my general observations. Anybody else? Get it? So let's just kind of go through this fairly quickly. I'll just talk about the highlights. But when you're writing, there's 2 main things you want to keep in mind. Whether it's an email, a text message, a grant proposal, it's audience and purpose. Who am I writing to and why am I writing? Right? Those are the main things. Who am I writing to and why am I writing to? As I said previously, how you write a grant proposal to a private foundation or a corporation is going to differ from National Science Foundation. How you write to something for social science is going to differ from mathematics. So you want to choose the right tone, the right style. You're setting up a world when they're reading it. What does this world look like? When that person reads this, what do you want them to get from the page? So it's really about audience and purpose, right? And again, a proposal is really 2 main things. It's a narrative, what you're going to do, and it's a budget, how much. And so if you did not come to the budget meeting, and even if you did, I highly recommend listening to that tape again. It's a tape, right? We didn't videotape it?
Videotape.
We videotaped it. It's worth looking at again, and even if you don't do that, work with Michelle or myself or anybody on the budget. I always recommend doing the budget first. There's lots of philosophies with approaching a grant. Some people will say write the narrative first and then do the budget. I always say consider doing the budget first, because you're not asking them to approve your idea as much as you're asking them to give you money. That's the main thing you're asking them for, right? So the idea is a big deal, and the two cannot be separated. But when you submit a grant, if this is the budget and this is the narrative, which one do you think they're going to look at first? Rhymes with this, right? So you want to look at the budget is a huge deal because it's a function of what you're going to do. And I've had a lot of proposals where I get the reviews back and it says, this is really a good idea. You're not asking for enough money, right? So you want to make sure that these two things correlate really closely between the scope of work of what you're going to do and how you're going to spend the money. And that's no small thing. That's part of it's science and part of it's an art. The rule of thumb is we have some handouts. I don't know, are the handouts available on your site that we did for the budget? Yeah. So there's a bunch of shortcuts in there, but one class, for example, a 0.2 class for a semester is about 8 hours a week. So it's 17 weeks. You would double that. Then there's summertime, because that's what you're doing is you're buying your time. And if you've never done it before, you got to say to yourself, okay, well, you know, I'm going to ask for one class, maybe two, and some summertime, and I could really use a graduate assistant, especially if you're going to have data that you need analyzed, or you're going to do a survey or whatever it is. You could really use some help, equipment, travel, and all that. So all that's covered in the budget workshop as well. So again, there's 3 levels of editing and writing: the idea or the concept, the organizational development, and then the sentence level. So the idea is just that. What are you going to, you know, what is it that you really want to do? In the previous, see, budget was first, and then how to develop a proposal, that's also online? Developing a proposal idea, I think, is also online, but there's a document in there that's an idea generator. And there's lots of different ways to, you know, sometimes people, they have a kernel of an idea, but it's not completely developed. There's lots of different ways to flesh that out, and that's what we go into in that particular workshop. And then organizational development, getting the sequence right, tone, that sort of thing. Oftentimes, people have an idea, but they don't know how to break it down and sequence it into specific steps and budget increments over a specific period of time. So is it a year? Is it 2 years? Is it 3 years? If it's really, really big, even with private grants and even some federal grants too, you want to go in, it's kind of like doing the R15 or doing the smaller grants too. You want to get your foot in the door. I mean, for all of you, if you haven't really gotten funding, or you've gotten just a little bit of funding, you're in this workshop because you want to be successful, and your goal is to be successful just a little bit first, you know. So it's really baby steps, and you have to persevere and you have to be patient. Again, to put together a federal grant takes a long time. When you submit it, it's 3 to 6 months, right, before you get the review. Then you get it. Then it's another 3 or 6 months before you can resubmit. So it's a marathon. You have to be very, very patient and just keep at it. I mean, I know faculty here that just have been tenacious and they're successful. So the salmon who stays at the falls gets upstream. We won't talk about what happens once they get up the stream. And then the last thing I put down is grammar and syntax, tone, rhetorical devices. And it's the last thing, but it's certainly not the least important thing. As I said, you want to make sure that it's squeaky clean. Give it to somebody who knows about editing. Make sure that your tense agreements are there. Make sure that you're not using, there's just, you know, some basic things with writing, right? Try to avoid passive voice. Make sure your tense agreements write in the third person as much as possible. You don't want to write from the perspective of I, right? Even, third person singular we, right? You can use the we form. We plan to do this, or we plan to do that. Generally, it's best to use the infinitive, which is the P, or, you know, the PI or
The team.
What's that?
Research team.
The research team, you know, try to speak as objectively as possible in terms of tone. So again, I went through some of these things, but in terms of telling the story, so you want to talk about the need, explication, scope of work, methodology, we talked about that. Evaluation and assessment and dissemination. So evaluation and assessment is your metrics, which is on the previous slide. But again, how are you going to evaluate what it is you're going to do? What's your definition of success. How are you going to explain to the sponsor that this thing's going to be successful under what what's your measurement tool? What's the bar there? Just in terms of evaluation and assessment, it's not down here, but you always want to look to see whether or not there's funding for it. The rule of thumb is that 5% of your grant goes for assessment and evaluation. And you also want to see whether or not they want an internal evaluation or do they want an external, right? Can you come up with your own metrics and do your own assessment, or do you need to have it done externally? What do you come across? Do you guys come across that very often in terms of external evaluations?
It actually depends on what the sponsor says. Sometimes they require it to be external.
It's often for training grants where you need to have this. And often they want an external evaluator.
Yeah, I'm seeing more and more, even in the private world, for external evaluations. So we have a whole bunch of people that do that. So again, a grant, the capacity for somebody to measure something is only as good as the quality of the methodology that goes out the door. So they sort of play off of each other. And going to the next page. So in terms of organizational development, right, there's a bunch of different ways you can come at this. The most obvious one is the very first one, just to answer the questions, right? How many times have you gotten students' papers back and they just didn't answer the question? It's a good answer, but it doesn't answer the question, right? Mm-hmm. Have you ever written that on a paper? Good answer doesn't answer the question. So I see it all the time. And I've gotten, not so much where I'm at right now, but when I was at the Research Foundation, I used to get faculty, and just almost every single answer they would put, they would just want to talk about one thing, right? Which is their thing. I don't blame them, but that wasn't the question. So you really want to answer the questions, and more, certainly this is true with private foundations, but probably also in the federal world, most things are electronic now. So, I just did a grant a little while ago. Well, actually, I think you submitted it for me, where it was 10 copies, but I haven't done that in 5 years, I think. Almost everything is electronic now, and so there's drop-down windows, especially in the private world too. Now, I don't know about federal grants. They're probably more leeway, but more and more in the private world, they restrict you on the number of words. So you have 150 words, and there might be 8 questions, and you're like, I can't. This is more complicated than that. You need to understand something. Sorry, pal. Stick to the 150 words, or you can't answer the question. Sometimes it's 250, sometimes it's 300. It depends. I'm not saying it's exactly the same amount, but more and more. Why? Because they get so many applications. So that's where your skill comes in with being, really, really concise. But at the end of the day, with private foundations, mostly they're going to ask you a handful of questions, and I think it's probably true with public grants as well. Oftentimes it's because they want to standardize things. So they're going to ask the same kind of a question. So they have scoring criteria that they use, and they give you so many points on how you answer that question. So as specifically as they can, they're going to ask the same question to the same people so they can, compare apples to apples. So that's a really, really big deal. Another way to think about it, if you're just brainstorming, is what is it that you want to do? So oftentimes faculty have an idea and they come and they sit down, and I said, okay, best case scenario, see that door over there? It's got all the money in the world. I'm going to give you all the money in the world. What do you want to build? How much? Everybody has an upper limit, right? So what is it that you want to do? Start with that end result and then work backwards. So you want to start with a gold standard. In my best world, this is what I'm hoping to achieve. This research question, this project, this implementation, this collaboration, this institute, this center, this particular research, this is what I'm hoping to prove or to show from there. And then from there, work backwards. I said, okay, so now you have $50,000. All of that costs $3.5 million. I'm going to give you $50,000. Where are you going to start? So it forces you to prioritize and then to go into it that way. So how long is this going to take you? I don't know, 3 years, maybe 5 years. What can you do in the first year? What do you absolutely have to do in the first year? You have to give yourself limitations and restrictions. So both with dollars and scope, it forces you to generate and prioritize and sequence. And the sequence is a really big deal, right? So you can start off with what we call associative thinking or clustering, where you have an idea in the center, and we do this in the other workshop, and you'll see this on some of the documents. This idea reminds me of this concept. This concept here reminds me of this. Oh, there's two affiliations who go with that. Oh, that reminds me. I did a paper like that when I was for my master's degree that did this. Oh, there's an expert research here. So you do that from all these things, but eventually you have to take all that and put it into a sequence. So that's one way to start, is start with the end in mind and then work backwards and how can I do it. I often tell people, if you're going to do a big idea, let's say it's 3 years or it's more than 1 year, and even if it is 1 year, but if it's in any sense of large scope whatsoever, and when I say large scope, I mean 150,000 to 200,000 or more, or over 1 year, consider doing it in phases. Or at least for your own mind, break it up in phases. Phase 1, I want to accomplish this. Phase 2, I'm going to accomplish this. Phase 3, I'm going to accomplish this. That way you have a sequence of how you're going to scale the project. You're going to have some preliminary data that you want to do. This is true for your methodology, right? You're going to do a lit review. You're going to write the questions up. You're going to execute the questions to this specific population in this specific area within this given time frame. That's phase 1. Phase 2, I'm going to, either scale that up, I'm going to evaluate that data, I'm going to do this, this, and this. Phase 3, I'm going to do a dissemination or whatever it's going to be. I'm going to ask for additional money. You're doing this with some of your work, right? That you want to scale up. Is anyone here doing something that they want to scale? That you've already done the work and you want to scale it up? Okay, so you're all starting from ground zero? Bueller? You're doing scale. What are you doing?
So, well, I started with by using national data that was previously collected, and so I have baseline of what we know in terms of national funds, and now I want to.
For what?
I'm looking at campus safety among Asian American college students.
Right.
So rapidly, before we can give the opportunity to Michelle to provide some information, I just want to emphasize one thing, as Paul mentioned it. What's important, once you have written your narrative, you want to have people who will review it. And in this case, that's why it's important that either, in fact, I would say that you should ask the people who are experts in your field to review what you have written, and other people who are not experts. Because it's important that anybody can understand what you are doing, because if they have questions, it means that you may have not well explained what you wanted to do or accomplish. And in this case, the funders, the reviewers from the funding agency may not understand it, and this is where maybe you will get some comments and where the decision will be either to fund you or not. So that's very important always. And for doing that, start early on to work on your project so you have enough time to get feedback from anyone that you think could be relevant. And for that, what I will do, I won't go into a lot of details about that, but I will provide you the feedback that was done by reviewers that were asked, some from our campus and external experts from CASA. They had a few years ago, they did a similar workshop where they asked some of their members, I think there were 5 or 6 faculty, to write a narrative, and then they were evaluated. And in fact, what was asked at that time, that each reviewer needed to provide some feedback, what they noticed, what was good or not in the proposal. So I will provide you those documentation so you can have a look at what the experts or the reviewers figure out to make sure that you do not do the same mistake, so you have a better chance when you submit. So that's something I will provide you. I have already some copies here, but what I will do, in fact, after when everything will be available, I can email you those documentation so you can have a look. And so basically, when you look at that, there are different things. So one, and I know Paul mentioned it, don't attempt to do too much. Or for instance, make sure that you describe the student involvement carefully if you have the students. Or describe the study with clarity and detail. So in a way, it's a summary of what we discussed, so you can have some additional information. So, and after that, another point that you may want to consider is that instead of being reviewed, you can also serve as a reviewer, because NIH, NSF, they are always looking for reviewers. And in fact, even if you don't have a lot of experience, it's a good way to learn how it happens and what they are looking for when you are asked to do the reviews. So do something like that. I would encourage you, because you can learn a lot by trying to review other proposals, and that's a good way. And I know that always, for instance, NIH, as I said, and NSF are looking for that. So you may want to, and if you go on their websites, they have often a link, do you want to be a reviewer? And they just ask you a few questions, and then they contact you when they have needs. So this is what I wanted to mention about that. And now I would like to give the opportunity to Michelle to talk a little about her input as a sponsor manager at the Research Foundation.
So I'm pretty much going to speak about tips. Going back to what Paul says, I'll be expanding upon that, and same with what Gilles mentioned. My main tips, and again, based on my own experience with working with the faculty for the last 12 years, is similar to what Paul spoke about, and I have similar advice as well. My main advice, though, is when you do find an opportunity, there's going to be a program solicitation, and you're going to be interested in submitting a proposal to that, right? There are guidelines, and I work mainly with NSF, the funding agency of NSF, NASA, NOAA. I do a little bit of NIH, but not much. But they all have high-level guidelines, what I call the agency guidelines, and they're usually like 400 or 500 pages thick. They're all online. They're all accessible to everyone. So the agency has its own guidelines as an umbrella for all proposals. Then there's the program-specific guidelines, the one that you're going to be submitting your proposal. So there are two sets of guidelines to look at. As a sponsored programs manager, I look at both of the guidelines, and I'm looking at them for compliance and comparing what you write in your proposal to the guidelines to make sure you've captured all the requirements that are there. And there's a lot of language in those guidelines that are specific to you as the writer, and I often recommend that you follow the agency's format and language. So I know from an NSF standpoint, usually the program solicitation pretty much is like an outline. It lays out what they want and how they want it to be presented. They use the words must, should, encourage. Those are important words. That means they want to see that information. Somebody already heard this from me. And if you speak in their language, it's easier for them to review because they're basing their merit criteria, basically their scoring, on those solicitation requirements. At the end of all of the NSF program solicitations, and then as well with NIH, they have a merit review criteria. Again, it's in the main guidelines, and there are also program-specific criteria. I often recommend that after you've written your proposal, that you go back and read the guidelines again, especially the merit review area, and then go back and read your proposal as an objective reviewer. So if you were going to be reviewing this proposal, did they meet the criteria? Because again, that's where you're going to be scored. So if you don't even meet that, you're not going to get a fund. So I often recommend that you do that like immediately after you've written your proposal, because you're going to throw all your information down. I agree with Paul. Go with everything down. Throw everything on the page, everything you want to do. Then take a step back and say, what can I really do? What's really important here? Can I put it in phases and so on? So, and that also helps you scale to your budget, because there's usually a budget cap. And so a lot of times new faculty like to just put everything in there, and they just are a little bit, it's a little overwhelming. And a lot of times reviewers come back and say, you're overachieving. You're just not, there's no way you can get it done. So again, put everything down, scale it back. And then it will fit your budget better in that regard as well. So other tips are, well, I can only say it 5,000 times, is read the guidelines. I read the guidelines every time somebody calls me and asks, because I'm working with maybe 10 different people at the same time. So I can't remember everything on the top of my head. So I will, when you call me, I will pull down the solicitation that you're working from, and if you ask me a question, I'm going to find the answer there or at the main guidelines. You can do the same thing. You can always call me and ask me the question. I'll try to find it for you. But you also can find the same information. It may not be as easy because I do it all the time. So, that's what I'm here to help you with. But this is really, I think, one of the most important things when you're writing your proposal. Again, the peer review, an excellent idea. Also having a conversation with your chair and or your dean or your dean of research are very helpful because they're experienced in proposal writing. They've been funded before. They can offer you a lot of tips and guidance as well and suggestions. So if you're getting stuck in that area, that I would turn to your chair or another expert in the field. And the language of the solicitation, I think, is quite important. And again, like I said, the layout, it's usually there. They kind of pretty much tell you how to write the proposal in most cases. I would say NIH and NSF and even NASA are like that. Not all funding agencies are that specific. We often do a lot with the U.S. Department of Education. Their program solicitations are like hundreds of pages thick, but they are very contradictory and confusing, even for us. But we will work with you on that. But if you look at, there's a lot of questions in there that need to be answered. So if you kind of outline your it's almost kind of like writing a paper, like a class paper. You outline it, you fill in, you answer the questions, and you're done, pretty much. So, so those are the main tips that I have. From the Research Foundation standpoint, as long as we have the time available, we will do a multi-level compliance review. We will read your proposal. We will speak to what your content is. We will ask questions. We're looking for many different factors. One are the agency's guidelines and regulations. The second one is the CSUs and our universities, things like curriculum and human subjects and things like that. Also, we're looking at too much of general information. Like if you generalize things so broadly, it's not very clear. And also you can't really say SJSU will provide because you can't speak for the whole university. You want to speak specifically. You want to speak what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, just like Paul was mentioning. So be more specific, be concise, be clear. And again, with the methodology and all those things, it's very important. A lot of times you have a section that talks about the proposal team and the qualifications in addition to your own biosketch or CV that's going to be added. Results from prior research, a lot of agencies are asking for that again to understand what you've done, you've proven yourself in other research. Yes.
Just quickly, what would examples of that be? Being like articles, books?
Actual funded research of any kind. If you had, NSF actually has a requirement that you have a section in there called NSF prior research results. If you don't have NSF prior research results, then you would just say this the PI does not have any. However, if you have a co-PI that does, that person's information would be there. So they're looking to see if there's anything there, because then they can see were you on time with your reporting and how did you manage your project and so on. It's kind of like an additional, it's almost like a reference in a way, would you think?
And the other aspect of that is often also they looked at as a preliminary data. that you have.
Oh, okay.
And that's
Right.
the reason why you need to mention that.
So there's all kinds of things, and there's also a section that we include in most federal grants is called current and pending, and we list all of the awards you've received, whether through Research Foundation, Tower Foundation, University, that are currently active, and then we also list anything that you're asking that you haven't received funding yet, so that they can see. Also, there's an area that would overlap with time, effort, and budget possibly. NSF only allows 2-person months on a project. So if you keep that in mind, if you're writing an NSF proposal, you're only allowed to ask for 2 months' salary per year. So that could affect your scope of work. They do not allow overload. So you can only work release time or intercession summer time. So,
Sorry. So does that mean, we can ask for 2 months of summertime, but then no release time?
that is correct.
Yeah,
Now,
that goes back to your other observation, though. What's the assumption there? The assumption is that the university is giving you that time.
Right.
So if you guys are on a 4-4, if you work at UC, they're on a 2-2.
Right.
Right? So the assumption is that you have a class, you have time dedicated to this already, so you have to find some other way to make that up.
And that is a struggle a lot for, because you guys do have a heavy teaching load. And we have run into situations with NSF that the proposal and actually the solicitation almost demand a higher level of work. And you can only ask for the 2 months. So there are some cases, and again, I suggest talking to the program officer. And that's another area I always suggest talking to the program officer while you're writing too. To say, this is obviously going to take, to do what you guys are asking, and what I'm going to propose is going to take like 4 months of my time. My teaching load is such that I need to ask for release time and summer. Sometimes they'll say that's fine as long as you can justify it. And so that, but there's and we have some language that we can help you with the justification of that. But most of the time it's 2 months. Now there are some colleges that do have some kind of incentive programs. I know College of Engineering currently has one that if you bring in a proposal that's $50,000 or more and you have full F&A, which are the indirect costs, then they would do some release time for you. And that information doesn't go into the budget area, it goes into what they call the facilities and other resources section, because we don't want it to be considered like cost share or matching funds, because NSF does not allow that. So there are kind of a lot of restrictions in a sense from NSF's point of view. So when you're writing, you have to consider those for what your scope of work is going to be, because if you're writing a scope of work that entails that you need to work 4 to 6 months out of the year, you're not going to be able to do it because they won't fund you because it's too much. So you, again, like Paul was saying, put everything in, scale it down. It's much easier to do it that way. I've worked with another faculty in engineering for many years, and she's developed this method of writing, and she basically puts everything in, everything that she could think of, what she wants to do overall, and then goes back to the guidelines, and then goes back to the proposal, and then starts scaling down. I think in a way it's a lot easier because then you have a better perception of what you're trying to say. Yeah, yes?
So I've reviewed grant proposals and I've been reviewed, and you've talked a lot about scope, budget, and compliance issues. None of those actually had factored into my experience reviewing or being reviewed. So I'm wondering, is there a threshold in which, I imagine the compliance issue, they're not even going to read it. It won't let you even submit it if it's not compliant. But where do the other things factor in?
At the end of the day, what your content is what they're going to look at. It's on you. It's the competitive nature of your proposal. So if you've met all the criteria, if you've answered all the questions, and you've reached their mission goals of the program, at the end of the day, the question is your proposal competitive enough? Because maybe there's another one or two people out there doing something similar to what you're doing, but they are more competitive than you. That is the part that's on between the reviewer and you, because we don't know what they're looking for. I mean, at the end of the day, it's what they say in the guidelines, but there's always a person there, and a person has an opinion, and a person has an idea, and so we don't know what they're thinking.
I'm just wondering, does the program, in NSF and NIH, does the program officer have the authority to not send it out to review because of scope, budget?
Well, there are several levels of review before it gets to the reviewer. So,
Okay, so that's behind the scenes for me.
And that part is a lot of what we're going to help you with to make sure we get past that part and get into the merit review. But again, if your topic hits right on what they're asking for, and we've checked for compliance, and we've spell checked, and we've formatted all the pages, and we've captured all the required data and components, it now gets into the merit review. Now you're up against everyone else who's in there, and now it's a matter of pretty much opinion, right? I mean, it's like those people in that room are deciding your fate. And you might have the most perfectly written proposal, everything there, but somebody else, even who doesn't have the most perfectly written proposal, could beat you and get the award. And that's because theirs was more competitive or more compelling. It's hard to say. A lot of times, you're going to submit, 10 proposals probably before you get one awarded. And that's a learning exercise. I always would suggest, definitely check the reviews, see what they said, talk to the program officer, find out what it is could you have done, better. Maybe they can give you suggestions and stuff. I've had proposals that have come back unfunded. However, the program officer has contacted the PI and said, we highly recommend you resubmit. And like Paul said, your success rate of resubmission is higher. And that's because you can speak to what the reviewers were saying. And a lot of times, a couple times I've heard, you're not asking for enough funding, ask for more. A lot of times you're asking for too much money and you don't have enough work. It's like it's out of balance and stuff. So there could be any number of reasons why. One of our faculty in engineering was submitting to NSF, and she just, every year, because it was an open solicitation, so she could submit every year. And she was just beating her head against the wall, and so she finally decided to become a reviewer herself. She went down and she became an NSF reviewer. Then she rewrote her proposal and she got funded. So speaking to what Jill said, that is a good support example to why it's important to be a reviewer, because it's not what you think it is. I know that Mark DeLarco talks about the review process for NIH, and it's quite an eye-opener. And it's quite surprising, from my point of view at least, because you guys all work very hard to write something, really well, and it sounds great, and, we read it and we're like, oh, this is a great proposal, it sounds really good, you should get funded, but we're not the decider. And then you don't get funded, and you're like, wow, what happened? And because we just don't know who else is out there asking for the same money. So being a reviewer would be really helpful in, again, writing the proposal.
That's what I'm saying, though, is I've been a reviewer, and these factors they weren't in play. We were actually told not to pay much attention to the budget. That would shake itself out. Mm-hmm. And the compliance issues obviously weren't within our purview.
You're reading the actual...
Even scope wasn't so much as what we were paying attention to as what was the content, what was the research, what was the background, was it relevant? Again,
going back to the solicitation, the merit review criteria is always listed in there. That's what they're being scored on. That's why I suggest I don't know that you did this, but a lot of faculty just overlooked that part. Mm-hmm. And I just find that as a big mistake because that's what you're being scored on. And so even if they have, pages and pages of here's what we want to hear, this is how we want it to be, laid out, this is what we want you to address, it's the merit review that they're scoring you on. That's where the reviewers are coming in. So that's really what I think is important to check your proposal against, because that's, again, where they're going to score you, and then how competitive it is. The other thing, too, is, again, with the tips that Paul's giving you for writing, really, it is important to capture their attention right away, because if you had 2 minutes to sell yourself to somebody and they're going to give you $1 million, you have 2 minutes to capture their attention. Do you want to do that at the end of your narrative or at the beginning of your narrative? Again, it's best to do it at the beginning instead of speaking to what's already been done out there, all the stuff that you're going to be continuing on or improving upon. Save that for the end. Start it at the beginning. Here's what the problem is. Here's, my suggestion. Here's how I'm going to do it. Then talk about why. Because if you don't capture their attention, if they have to read 5 pages of what has already been done, they're going to toss it. So it's important, again, capture the attention right at the beginning, be clear, be concise, and spend a lot more time on that methodology and like Paul said, how you're going to do it instead of, because a lot of times I see 1 to 2 paragraphs on that. That should be more extensive. And again, your qualifications are important. Those are usually like a half a page. So, we know that kind of standard formatting of what a proposal is. You have 1 to 5 pages to talk about prior results. And a lot of times the solicitation tells you how many pages they're expecting or how many words they're expecting. NSF is getting a little more restrictive in that they're asking for specific information in the project summary abstract, and it is limited in words, so you need to be careful with that, but you have to hit the broader impacts and the intellectual merit, which is important. Sometimes they want keywords. You also have to hit the broader impacts in the actual proposal itself. That's important for them too, because if they're going to fund you just for this and it's going to be done, wouldn't their money be better invested in something that has a broader impact?
What Michelle just mentioned about what the requirements are, for instance, from NIH, NSF, we have templates from NIH and NSF what the requirements are during the next hour of the workshop, and we will also give you the opportunity to look at successful grant proposals that have been submitted and awarded by colleagues from our campus. So you have this opportunity, and at the same time you can talk to all of us. So before we have a few minutes break and we go into the workshop, I know Paul wanted to say something.
I just read some reviews from National Science Foundation on a STEM grant that was submitted, and the way that they did it for the merit criteria, if you look at the back of every RFP, they list all the merit criteria. And what you should know is that when they're scoring this, they're giving points to each one of those things. So, what you want to do is review it yourself. Did I talk about this? It's right here. Check. 4.2. Check. Go through that, that whole thing yourself. In this particular case, it was about evaluation. The PI on this proposal said that they were going to use a particular kind of a methodology based on a theory of change. And in the evaluation, they said they were going to use WestEd to do the evaluation, but they didn't talk about the merit of WestEd. They didn't talk about the success of WestEd. They didn't talk about the capabilities of WestEd or any of that. Consequently, they got like out of 10, I think they scored them something like 4.6. So there were 2 questions where they didn't go in, they weren't as thorough as they could have been. They just made some assumptions. And so oftentimes with a proposal, there's a threshold at which they're going to fund, meaning that let's say there's 6 reviewers. You need to get 5 excellents and 1 very good, right? So that has a particular kind of a score. In this case, we got something like 79. They funded it at 91. So we fell short on a couple of points, and those points were broken down according to that merit review where they didn't address this specific area. So when I read through it, not the faculty, but somebody in the department came up to me and they said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, great reviews, very specific, real easy to address. You can go back and talk about WestEd. You can go back and talk about the methodology. You can expand on that particular theory of change." So you have to look at specifically what it is that they're looking for. Is that helpful? Yeah. So really methodology and evaluation are the two big things as opposed to just scope and even budget. So the other thing I want to say is plan ahead. The challenge at this university is that you are in a 4-4. You are very limited in your time. You have your RTP, you have your committee work, you have your advising, et cetera, et cetera. So you don't have a lot of time. What I would do is if you all have a sense of what it is you're going to do, you know the area that you're going to work in, I would use every bit of extra time that you have, use the holiday break, use the spring break, use the summertime to take a generic proposal, and there is one, I put up a generic proposal writing guidelines on the last session that we did around developing a grant proposal. You could go, if you have a sense of an NSF or a federal agency that you want to look at or you're thinking about, whether it's an R15 or whatever it is, use that and say, let me just answer these questions. It's a really good exercise to do, but plan ahead, because when you tend to react to, you got something that's going to come out in 6 weeks and you're like, I'll get to it. And then we get it, I know right away whether or not they did it at the last minute. And so, it's the old adage in accounting, garbage in, garbage out. So, you really want to put some time into it and plan ahead. There's a document, I think, that's up on the RISC website or wherever it is that Amy and these, I create a table for faculty, and it's 3 years, it's 36 months, and it has what you're going to teach, what you're going to submit in terms of your RTP, how many publications you want to apply for, how much advising you're going to do, how many committees you're going to serve on. It's got everything in there that you could possibly do, and then by semester, and then you want to fill out, when am I going to apply for this grant? You need to budget time to do that.
Where is this table, Paul?
I think I will check with Amy.
That would be very helpful. Yeah.
It's so my name and my email's on there, and if you don't get it from Jill, is there
send it to me.
I'll send it to you, yeah.
Then I can forward it to
But that's just, again, it's a tool, and you can just change it however you want. You can do it for 18 months, you can do it for 1 year, you can do it for 5 years. I tell people when I hand it out, it's a tool, it's for you. Change it every single semester. This is what I taught, this is what I'm going to teach, this is when I have time to write. So, but it's like anything else. You want to budget time to do it. And so you also want to, how many people here are doing the RISCA cohort next semester?
UGA.
UGA? Oh, good, yeah. So you'll see that again in there too. Any other questions?
So just to mention again, I will ask Paul and everybody to give me all the information. So once I have everything, I can provide it to you. And if you don't have something, just let us know and we will provide you. Because whatever we showed you, it's for you to use. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. And once it's available, we will give it to you.